Thank you for that introduction. And I'm excited to talk with all of you about organizational values with soul. You are free to use the chat throughout this whole presentation. I will be asking you a couple questions to respond to in chat. So hopefully you have chat handy. Zach's going to be monitoring it, so I don't have to. So here's what we're going to do today. Brief look at organizations with soul. What do we mean by that? Why values matter, especially in today's world right now. What is the process for discovering your values? What is that like? We're going to take a look at a case study and then finish up with how do you translate values into actions? And then there'll be some time at the end for questions. So Zach mentioned that I have an organization design firm. It's called Canopy Gap. And a canopy gap is a phenomenon that happens in any forest ecosystem, and somehow light must enter the top of the forest for new growth to occur on the forest floor. If we had time, I'd talk about the various ways that can happen, but the forest is an amazing thing. And it teaches us a lot about how we can function as organizations. So organization design, essentially that means how do we help teams, organizations, networks work more effectively together, working and relating more effectively. And here's a clue. This is not an elitist field. Everyone is a designer. If you make a decision, which you do, what you ate for breakfast, what you're eating for lunch, perhaps right now, you are designing your lunch. We design our days, and we also design our organizations. The legacy of how we've designed organizations is let's go with what works. But the question that has to be posed with that is who gets to say what works or not? And we are at a time in our history of evolution of the way organizations are structured and how they function that we're more broadly and inclusively looking at what works. And so this is a very exciting field of organization design, especially with the statistics. Gallup determining just 5 years ago that 85% of global workers are not fully engaged. How is that going to change? And I think the field of organization design is addressing that directly. We are in this time of uncontrollable uncertainty. I would say that we've always been in a time of uncontrollable uncertainty. It's just more evident and obvious to us all right now. And so there's a lot of shifting with how organizations are structured, how they're working together, some beautiful experimentation that's going on across the globe. And I refer to that uncontrollable uncertainty as the mess. It's a mess. By a mess, I don't mean that it's good nor bad, it's just complex. And so how do our organizations function amidst all of this complexity, this constant change? In this mess, you may acknowledge some of these statements that we don't know what will happen next. We're not very good at controlling outcomes, that a single problem seems to be connected to other problems, and we can't know the impact of our actions and choices in advance. So this is the world we live in, and why our role as designers, no matter what function you have within an organization, is so essential. You get a chance to make decisions that impact the mess that we're in. And we're really in the midst of changing the way we see the world from one that's focused solely on what's more efficient to where is there more life. And where there is more life, as in the forest ecosystem, efficiency tends to take care of itself. So how do we have organizations with more vitality? In the field of organization design, we work within these domains of action. So you might ask, well, what exactly do you do? How do you bring life? Well, we look at how teams are formed, the structures, how meetings, communication flows, agreements between peers, the values, which we're going to talk about today, how the organization learns, the rituals and practices, how we make decisions, and even compensation as a part of the world of organization design. Zach already mentioned some of the firms that Canopy Gap has worked with, and You don't need to go there. The way that I like to look at it is an organization full of life or vitality has people showing up as their full creative selves, working together for something greater than themselves. When people can show up as their full selves, that tends to be a vital organization that exhibits these dynamics of life, that even with setbacks and challenges, there's some resilience, there's some adaptability. And that is what our work is dedicated to. It's working within those dynamics of life and getting to the soul of the organization. So the organizational values with soul, the difficult part of that is in order to have values that have soul, your organization needs to have a soul, but it already does. Even if things are tough, if they're rough, there are flowers budding within that organization. That is the nature of life. So if you're close to a keyboard, what would you say is a sign of life in your organization? And go ahead and type something in the chat, and I'll give you a couple prompts. People laughing, perhaps, is a sign of life. People not sitting idly at their computers or in their cubicles all day. People taking breaks. People connecting, maybe friendships forming. Not necessary, but it often happens. What is a sign of life in your organization? So we've looked at the territory here, this uncontrollable uncertainty, which we refer to as the mess. And this is a place where values are so essential because we're in this midst of a shift in how we see the world, when for decades, if not centuries, we've been pretending that we can tame the wild and be in control. That we can control people, that we can control outcomes, that we can control nature. Here's a picture of a friend of mine, Rachel Happy. We used to run an organization called the Community Roundtable, helping community managers in different organizations learn best practices from each other. And they released t-shirts a few years ago that control is for amateurs. I love it. I have one in my drawer. And this world of control, we want this order, just like these monocultural fields right here, where everything is planted in a straight row. It's the same. This is how we've wanted our organizations to be. But it's not necessarily our fault. It's what we've been born into, that we've thought that the world is predictable, that it's controllable. And if we break it down into little parts, we can understand it. And the metaphor for this age is that of a machine. This is a reason we need values so much, because teams and organizations don't function well as a machine. We have lots of evidence that in fields across science, that this mechanistic way, this control-based way, this order-focused way is incomplete. It's not wrong. There is order in the universe. It's good to have order on your team. The desire for control or the impulse for control is not bad. But it's been out of balance. And as a result, this 85% of disengaged workers, they're trying to be useful. They're trying to be productive. They're trying to be problem-solving machines, and it's not working well. This age of scientific management, which is how do we control labor? That is coming to a close. So how can we be effective when control doesn't really work? Well, values is an important answer to that. It's not the only answer, but it's a very important answer. So here's one way of looking at it. In the mess of today's world, something must guide how we are and what we do together. With so much complexity, with so much that can't be controlled, with people and their different personalities and their different needs. What can guide us as to how we are and what we do together? And it's also points to the limitation of policy or codes of conduct, which are in a way instruments of control. Values may be broader, allowing people to fit their own personal needs, desires, the way they work into something larger that can work for them. So values are commitments, but they're not just commitments to who we are. They're commitments to what we aspire to. So there's both this, when we're discovering our values, we're both looking at what is right now. What is it about the people in this organization, the mission that we have, what we've been tasked with, and then where are we going? What are we reaching for? That aspiration part of values is partly what makes it resonant, that it's not just a pure reflection of our current state, but it's something that we want to move toward. And values also help us define what we say yes to and what we say no to. There's a lot of talk about self-organizing teams right now, and many organizations experimenting with it. And there's a fear that comes along with this. What if we make so many people decision makers? Well, values is partly what keeps the coherence of all those decisions, because we make decisions based upon our values. That influences what we say yes to and what we say no to. And it also helps us hold each other accountable. And the way that we see the world is that the peer-to-peer accountability is more important than the hierarchical accountability. The peer-to-peer accountability is more connected to intrinsic motivations. And so values is a way for one person to say to another, hey, great job. I really appreciate how you lived up to that. Or I think you might be falling short. Can we have a talk about this? So how do we get to these things called values? How do we discover them for our team or for our organization? I'm going to start with a quote because I think it's a great place to start. A leader will find it difficult to articulate a coherent vision unless it expresses her core values, her basic identity. One must first embark on the formidable journey of self-discovery in order to create a vision with authentic soul. There's that word. And Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi wrote, many of you probably know, a beautiful, well-researched book on flow, the state of flow. And what this quote means to me is a place to start with your organizational values, especially if you're in a leadership role, is to be able to tap into what is core to you, not what your values should be, but what do you sense in yourself. So we're going to look at 3 key principles in discovering your team's values or your organization's values. And the first one is participation. Really what I'm saying by this, that if you have a small committee in a large organization that is tasked with coming up with our company values, that is not the best way to go about it. Not that it can't be effective, but you're limiting participation. If you have a team of 8 or 10 speaking for a team of hundreds. I love this quote by Peter Block, who wrote kind of one of the most important books on community. People are committed to what they have a hand in creating. And what that principle of participation means to me is the more that we can involve people in a process, the more likely they are to feel some ownership of it, to feel connected to it, to abide by it. And so when we are discovering our values, we want that participation to be broad and diverse. Here's a way of looking at it, that you can start with a core team, just a small circle, who's talking about where are we going to get our data from? How should we approach this? And to expand those concentric circles outward so that you're involving more and more and more people. Typically, when we are working with teams on this, the closer you are to the center of the circle does not mean that you hold the highest leadership positions. It means that you are representative in some way. And the closer you are to the center, the more time that you are devoting to this process. Once you get to the box outside the circle there, those are people who are there to confirm. And that is often done by, a survey. We're thinking about this, how does this resonate with you? These cross sections of team members providing input are a key part in exploring your values as a team or as an organization. So participation is the first principle. The second principle we want to look at is facilitation. And the root of facilitation is actually French and means to make easy. And it's true, and it's a little bit misleading, because a great facilitator helps make decisions more easily. They know how to involve participation. They know how to work with what is happening in the team or in the room. So let's talk a little bit more about facilitation. What exactly is facilitation? Well, here's a picture of a kitchen here, because if you've been in a restaurant kitchen before, or if you've dined close to one, or even your imagination, there's a lot of activity that happens in the kitchen. And the facilitation of a good meal happens with the back of the house and the front of the house working together. Timing is everything. Communication is important. And that's all being facilitated when you have a good experience. So why do we need facilitators? Well, if we gave you a playbook for how you are supposed to do this, it's probably going to go off track because there's going to be stuff that you didn't expect. There's always exceptions. Context is everything. That drawing up a process and sticking to it is not good, a good practice when you're working with human beings. And so facilitation is a way of actually bringing people together that is necessary for complex efforts. So we look at 4 things for effective communication: is somebody or a team of people who are making sure that the small details and the large big picture are all being addressed, the parts and the wholes fit, that there's an understanding of the whole, that there are voices heard, that there is a sense of equity in the facilitator. A good facilitator knows when some voices are not being heard and some voices that need to be amplified, and bringing those into the conversation. Effective facilitation strengths are realized that some people may have analytical capabilities, some people may be better at heartstorming, and can bring those attributes out in the facilitation process. And with effective facilitation, flow happens, that there are connected actions where you have a sense that I'm a part of something that is moving. So we say that facilitated is a very important part of getting to team or organizational values. Sometimes that means you need to hire some help. And sometimes you have this talent inside the organization, and maybe it hasn't been recognized, or I would say that any organization that doesn't have facilitation talent should be moving in that direction. Because then you get all of these feedback loops. By feedback loops, you mean we understand what the responsiveness is, that an idea is submitted, and that idea people feel free to respond to, and the idea iterates. Facilitation is key for that. And then outside of just a small group, in a whole organization, facilitation is effective at breaking down silos, at bringing a network lens, which is not trying to control a process, but is helping cultivate trust, being able to be helping the communication flows go back and forth freely. So the first thing we looked at was participation, get broad and diverse participation. The second was make sure we have some chosen facilitation for this exploration of values. And the third is heart. And if you can take one thing away, I think this is the most important, that exploring your values as an individual or as a team or as an organization is not just a cognitive exercise, because values are something that are deep within us. They are reflections of who we are. And getting to that, we need to be able to work both with our emotions, our heart power, and our thinking and analytical capacity. So how do we know if the group is actually tapping into the heart? Well, there's a feeling to that. There's what we refer to as resonance. And you'll know it when you're in the room, when there's resonance. Perhaps it's hard to put language around, but when we are facilitating organizations that are looking at what horizons they want to move to or what values they want to operate by, there is a strong, clear sense when you touch upon something that is like, yeah, that's it. That's resonance. In order to have resonance, we do need safe environments. We can't get to the power of the heart without the safety. And when we look at safety, we look at, is there room to fail? If there's not room to fail, it's not a safe environment. Is harm repaired? That is key. That consent is honored, meaning that we minimize coercion and we invite people into participation. And then finally, that other people's thoughts, feelings, and experiences are welcomed. There's very little judgment, that diverse perspectives are seen as valuable to the team or organization. If you have these four qualities, then you have a safe environment, and it's easier to get to that power of the heart. Then the other ways you get to the power of the heart is you just mix up the practices and rituals a little bit to try to do it a little bit differently. Perhaps not sitting in a conference room, perhaps starting off a session with music or a poem, perhaps having a little check-in where people can share a little bit. These are ways to tap into the power of the heart. So we can't talk about organizational values without mentioning that there's these personal values too, that I have values, and where do they come together, and is there tension between personal values and organizational values? So it's kind of a complex matter because it doesn't mean that my personal values automatically translate into the organizational values, but there should be a coherence, and that me as an individual in the organization, I feel resonant with the organization's values, though they may be different than the personal values. And one thing just to keep in mind is that we're talking about putting things into language here, and language is always imperfect. That you are not just your values as an individual, that you can never just describe somebody by their top 3 values. And so understanding for team members to be able in a process to take a short period of time to explore their personal values and to explore together the organizational values, then they can start to see overlap and start to see, oh, I get it. Like I bring this value to the team, though the team says this differently. It's different language. And one way you know when you're touching upon your personal values is when it gives you energy. And one of the definitions of energy I love is the capacity to do stuff. And so when you are having a conversation, and whether it's about integrity or truth telling or compassion, if you feel yourself come alive, if you become energized, you are actually gaining in capacity. And if you can work that way, work in an environment that way, the organization is going to benefit as well. So here are just some common values. When we are going through a values sort or a values exercise, we'll give people a long list that will just tip their imagination a little bit. It's never comprehensive. People can come up with their own. And I'm not going to read them out, but I am curious for any of you brave souls out there right now, are you willing to type in one of your personal values into the chat? It'd be great to see. Zach, will you read a few of those off without naming names?
Take the narrow path, balance, learning, commit to learning and growth, integrity, courage, freedom. That's what we got so far. Some good ones.
Sounds great. Yes, I love it. So we're going to look at just an example of what happens when you embark upon this path of discovering an organization's values. So we'll often pull up an illustration like this, that who you are as an organization is like the roots of a tree. It's not a marketing thing, your identity that you're trying to project out into the world. This is who you are. And then how that displays itself in the world is like the trunk of the tree. It's core. It's what all the branches and the leaves come off of, the vision and the values. So we're looking at a private company that Canopy Gap actually worked with in partnership with CultureCon. You heard Zach mention that CultureCon does some consulting at the beginning, and Canopy Gap is thrilled to be a partner of CultureCon and work together on engagements. So we're helping a private company, about 250 employees, explore their identity through the lens of what are their values. And the way that we went about that is by setting up some initial conversations. And we wanted to talk with people in every department. We wanted a cross-section so that every group was represented. These were not extractive interviews. They were really conversations with some playful questions, encouraging people to think and imagine in metaphors and images and to see what comes up. Those conversations help kind of us orient and get a feel for the values of the organization. At that, in those initial conversations, we never ask, what do you think your organization's values are? This was more a creative exploration. But at the same time, we did have a survey that went out at that time for people to respond to their current set of values that they hold as an organization, and a number of questions that were ranking, but most of them were open text for that first. We were just collecting a bunch of information to find some themes. All in all, people contribute over 130 hours of time to this discovery of the values. So in those conversations, the themes start to emerge. When you take all those notes and all those creative cues, and you both get a feel, and you can start to put some language to it. And we took those themes and shared the themes back to all 45 people. And then in the first workshop, getting their response to, does this feel resonant to you? Is this what you experience? And we looked at some quantitative data too. Based upon what came out of those conversations, looking at some specific values and how people would rank those values. In this case, is a very fun organization to work with. One of their descriptive phrases were, "We're a little crazy." And it actually was a heartfelt, positive statement of they liked how creative and risk-taking they were as an organization, a leader in their field. And then we had these series of workshops which had different sets of people in each of the workshops. So the first workshop was sense making on all of those themes that came out of the conversation. And the people participating in that workshop got a chance to respond to and help shape what was coming out of those themes. So narrowing a bit on this broad territory of 45 conversations into this second workshop was to sort and simplify a bit, to toss some things to the side and to start to narrow in what's most important. And then in the third workshop, translating those narrowed sense of themes into some value statements. And these would be short phrases in which every word was played with until we got a combination of words that people got really excited about. And then we had work group sessions to kind of finalize what they had created. This ended up involving many more than 45 people, which is ideal. Probably about a third of the company got involved, and then these values were revealed at an all-company meeting. You can see that we got to these value statements, and then people got to respond to those. So it's always a mix of quantitative data and conversation. Word clouds based upon open text so they can get a feel. Of course, you need sticky notes. And then we need to sort those sticky notes. So sorting them into the core values. This is what was happening before those value statements. And now this was the process we followed. And these are the outcomes, just so you can get a feel for it. The first in bold is kind of a summary, but as we champion people and are passionate about inclusivity. We are relentless about strengthening your journey. We are accountable to those we serve. And we welcome challenges. So I'm curious for the people, how do you respond to those as value statements? Does that feel energizing, exciting, confusing, dull, imprecise? Why don't you type your response into the chat? Clear, empowering. Yeah, the clarity, I think that took a lot of time to get to the clarity. When you're looking for both clarity and resonance. And then when the whole company got to hear these, they of course were so excited that felt less flat than the values that they had been operating by or that were on their wall. So values in action. So if we were to stop there, it would have been a connecting exercise. People would have felt engaged, but then where do you take it from there? And this is actually not too complex. You follow the same process to go back to cross sections of people and ask the question of, in these different domains of action or in different departments, how do we apply this "we welcome challenges" to meetings? How do we apply that "we welcome challenges" to communication flows, to rituals and practices, and to not have a small subset of people deciding something for the entire company, but having teams decide for their own experiments on their own what they want to do as a team, and having very few company-wide experiments, because what we want is for different departments to be experimenting with how they're going to put those values into action, and then the communication flows across, and that all becomes energizing. That's how the values get into action, through these what we call agreements, which is, we're going to try something as a team. We're going to try it for 2 weeks. And then we're going to get together and have a chat about how it worked. Or we're going to vote it, whether to continue or whether to adapt the experiment. So a lot of organizations stop their values process once they determine what they are. And they're limiting the power and the capacity of values to inform the creative actions that an organization takes. So if you take this the next step, that's when the values become what we say is embodied, where people start to actually live and work with their values. And the team dynamics are such that those values just become a part of it. They don't have to remember them because they're being the values. And this is one thing that I love about seeing this process happen, is that those team dynamics, they're interconnected. When a team is fully alive and having fun and taking wise risks together and adapting, that actually can become contagious. So the contagion effect, we all know that viruses are contagious, but we're just understanding in the last 2 decades how states of being are contagious, that joy or depression or that well-being, that it's not just the people who are in your immediate circle who start to move towards that state, that actually has an effect beyond the people who you have direct contact with. That's why it's referred to as the contagion effect. And all of this is, we see as part of wiring the organizational nervous system, making sure those synapses are all ready to go. And when an organization they're fully wired, they're responsive to the world and they're responsive to each other. So as means of summary, going back to these 3 principles of diverse participation, don't let just a committee do this. The employee facilitation at every stage, make sure that that's clear. And bringing the heart into this, not making this purely a cognitive exercise. And then making sure that you don't stop there, but you translate them into actions and experiments, both within teams and across teams. So there is my email address, todd@canopygap.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Todd Hoskins. And there's the website, there's the podcast and leadership mentoring program. And now it's time for questions. Zach, do we have any questions?
Not yet, not yet. while we wait for questions, like I mentioned in the start, we'll post the recording of this in our CultureSpace community under the group section. Just hit webinars and you'll find it in there. So if you want to share it with a colleague or rewatch it, feel free to do so. You do have two questions coming in now. Do you want me to read them off?
We also have one from David Bryant in the Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah, you tell me which one to address first.
Let's start with David Bryant in the Q&A.
Okay, David asks, how did you land on a number of values to create? Is there a number that is too few or too many? I don't think that there's too few, there is too many. And we didn't come in to this with an idea of how many we were going to get. I think once we were clustering those themes, we knew we wanted to get a certain amount of core territory covered. And so at one point it was 6. And then it felt really good to narrow it down to 4. And I would say in most cases, 3 or 4 or sometimes 5 is more memorable. Once you get above that, then it's like, I can't remember what value number 7 is. Thanks for the question, David. All right, what else, Zach?
We have a few questions in the chat here from Corey Hoffman. Are there questions we can ask ourselves to help uncover our own values?
Mm-hmm. I think the most important one is what makes you feel alive. That is the one that will get people closest to that. And I think sometimes it's great to involve other people. And so if I myself were to ask Zach, Zach's a friend of mine, so I might go up to Zach and say, hey, Zach, I'm doing a little bit of reflection right now. And I wondered how you experience me in what I bring to the world. And just listen and see, and others are a wonderful source for that. But if you're just asking yourself, I'd say, what makes you come alive?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Another question from Don. Do you define behaviors based on those values, manuals, trainings?
Great question, Don. There's a fine line between expected behavior and mandated behavior. There's laws for mandated behavior, and laws are necessary for safety and for equality. In an organizational context, especially when you get into matters of the heart, it's best when they are core principles, or where they are, you could refer to as guardrails and guideposts, language that is not specific, you have to or you must not. What we usually do coming out of the values exercises is, rather than saying how that must look, teams coming up with agreements of what they want to try. And those behaviors, trying on of new behaviors as a organizational habit. When organizations are willing to try on new behaviors, they are more innovative and adaptive. So we're always looking for ways that teams and across teams can engage in their own experiments. Trainings is, I think, less common, but I will say having external stimuli. So if you're a team in one industry, bringing in people from the arts or music or from a completely different industry, that's an important part of, I guess it's different than training, but to constantly have that divergence stimulation is important.
All right. Another question here. Do you see the process being any different when the goal is to reassess the current values versus creating values from scratch? That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes. Because the case study that we looked at, they already had a set of values. So one of the first things we did was we did some surveys on how they felt about the current values. And trying to find that, is there something valuable within the values to hold on to keep? And values need to evolve. So once you do reach a set of values, perhaps 2 or 3 years later, it should be reassessed. If you're starting from scratch, and we often do with startup organizations, we just skip that respond to what currently exists, and usually start with more the imagination, the creative, getting people to say, what do you love about working here? What draws you to this? And also trying to not avoid the question of what do you hate about this place or what do you wish you could change. But that's a different thing than values. Those need to be addressed. Those cultural challenges need to be addressed, but we want to lift up what's working when we're assessing values.
We have 2 more questions here. AJ wants to know, how long did the process from the case study take?
AJ, I think we could have done it in 3 months. It took about 6 months, partly because summers and scheduling. I think to engage in 3 to 6 months is a good time frame.
And then the last question here from Don again, what are some examples of things that teams implemented based on the values?
One of the domains of action that we love starting with is meetings. And the reason is that there's just not a lot of organizations that do meetings well. And so usually when we're doing work around values, one of the first domains we look to is meetings. And so the examples of what's being done in meetings can be that, okay, there was one organization that said, we will not hold a company meeting unless there is a representative from each department in that meeting. Otherwise, we're not going to have meetings anymore. That was an experiment. Another experiment was, we're going to start every meeting with two minutes per person to share what they're excited about that they're working on. Another organization started a revolving facilitator for their meetings. They decided that they wanted to have facilitated meetings. And so they looked into how can we feel like we have those skills down? What do we need in order to have that across our team? And then a month at a time, they would facilitate their team meeting, and then they'd pass it to the next person, which is a wonderful practice too for playing with power dynamics if you don't have the same facilitator for every meeting. Those are some examples with meetings. There's been transparency as a value. If you're going to name transparency as a value, then there's a lot of things you're going to look at. So companies that have opened up their compensation so that everyone can see, a company that has both opened its books and trained every employee on how to read a balance sheet. So once you take the value, and cross-reference the domain and let the team come up with ideas. And then it's the same thing, the resonance is like, let's try that, and not trying too many, because this is like, you don't want a backlash effect of too much change and experimentation at once.
Awesome. Well, that is all the questions we have, and we're just about at time. So we'll cut things off there. But yeah, Todd, thanks again for being here. Awesome presentation as usual. Any last words for the group?
If you're going to embark upon this, make sure you're having some fun. And when Zach and I are working together, we're making sure that we're having fun. So I think that's always a good rule of thumb.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not having fun, you may need to examine the process.
Definitely. Well, cool. Thanks again, Todd. Yeah, we'll catch up real soon. And thanks to everyone for joining us today for another CultureSpace webinar.
Thanks, everyone.